traveling through this weary land, there is no sickness, no toil, no danger in that fair land to which I go.
Well, welcome to Presbycast. Presbyterian here. Some of you may not believe it, but many of you might, that approximately 2 hours ago, I didn't know that I was going to be doing this tonight. But here I am. Nevertheless, I persisted, and we've got a great show lined up. I did know that this show and this topic was happening. I should state that for the record. I was not informed by my intrepid co-host of what night we were recording.
If you'll check the messages, it's all there.
What messages? There were no emails. There were no messages. This is all getting very shady in the back channel of internet radio.
Sounds like a Hillary defense to me. But
well, I'll wait for the HBO documentary to sort this out. But welcome to Presbycast. That was Chortles Weekly, and why don't you pitch our guest and get into it, because I'm actually really looking forward to this.
Well, he is a repeat guest. We occasionally have new guests around here, but there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. Dr. Ben Shaw, who has an interesting, authentically broken journey to this point. We'll talk about some of that. But how are you, Dr. Shaw, down there in, it's Florida now?
Yep, it's Sanford, Florida. Doing well. Moved down here. Been here really just 8 months. Moved down at the very end of December, and well into my second semester teaching at Reformation Bible College.
So after you'd been in Florida about a month, did you notice your cognitive abilities were slipping, or if you took one of those online IQ tests, did it seem to be lower than before?
Not so far as I could tell, but the news is definitely interesting down here.
Well, I was trying to. I'm not much of a math person. My wife certainly is, but I'm trying to think how many points the average IQ went up when you moved to Florida. Raise the taxes to go along with it, though. So you do teach at Reformation Bible College now, late of Greenville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. For that, of course, I know you because about 11 years ago, maybe it was 12, you did a good bit of supply preaching in my church, and I think you did a mini series on, was it Ecclesiastes?
Yeah, I did. I did.
So that's part of what we're going to talk about tonight. But tell us about we'll make Carl Truman happy, your authentic faith journey. He loves that term. See? Tell us how you got to where you are. Because you didn't start.
Way around.
Sure, yes.
Yeah, I grew up in Roswell, New Mexico, UFO Central. And after I graduated from college, went to seminary at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, where John Gerstner, whose name may or may not mean anything to most of your listeners, was still teaching, but he was the mentor for R.C. Sproul.
That was a mainline seminary, though, or is.
Yeah, it still is. It's a PCUSA school. The
PCUSA, yeah.
Yeah. Then went to Princeton for a Master of Theology. Did doctoral work at Duke for a degree that never was. Well, it was finished, but my dissertation was failed. So I left there with the token MA, and then eventually got a PhD at Bob Jones University. So I've been all over the map school-wise, and
that's what we call range. When you when you start at a mainline seminary, and then you end up at Princeton. We have to play the Machen horn for Princeton. We use we popularized the hashtag Justice for Machen.
Yeah.
So I hope you did some vandalism while you were up there, but you don't have to admit to it.
Well, it's a range. It's a range that Weird Al Yankovic could really respect. Just to be able to go from a Michael Jackson cover into a polka medley, into a riff on American Pie. So
Right.
we respect the range.
Yeah. Good.
So from a mainline seminary, albeit with some evangelical, really good guys in it, to Princeton, the flagship seminary of the PCUSA, to Duke, to Bob Jones. Now, the culture at Duke and Princeton and Bob Jones probably a little different.
Just a little bit. Yeah. Yeah.
So, as you were doing this, what were your denominational affiliations? How did they shift and change?
Well, I grew up in the PCUSA. Well, actually, in the UPCUSA back before the Southern and Northern denominations merged in '82 or '83, I guess it was. But so that's the church I grew up in. When it looked like I was headed to seminary, the presbytery that I was in told me I could go to any seminary I wanted to, as long as it was a PCUSA school. So for a lot of bad reasons, I ended up at Pittsburgh, not knowing anything at all really about the school or any of the faculty there. It was only obviously when I got there that I found out where I had ended up. Certainly not through my own planning or my own intentions. But
Now, what year was that when you arrived at Pittsburgh?
1977.
Okay. All right. So my Presbyterian history has some gaps through the 70s there. I don't know what was going on, but I gather it was a mixed bag by that point.
Yeah, it was. And while I was in seminary, partly, obviously through some of the influence of Dr. Gerstner, but mostly through students who had come to study with Gerstner, I became Reformed, and as part of the process, we came to the conclusion that women shouldn't be ordained to church office, and so when I told my presbytery that, they told me, well, you probably ought to find a denomination that's more in line with your views. And so
they weren't tolerant. They
weren't
tolerant of a minority opinion.
No, the couple of years before I went to seminary, I don't know if you know the name about the Kenyon case, Wade Kenyon. It was he went to Pittsburgh Presbytery, wanted to be ordained, and because he couldn't participate in the ordination of women, they denied him ordination. The case went to the General Assembly, and the General Assembly upheld the presbytery. So that was still pretty fresh when I started at Pittsburgh, and so my presbytery wasn't going to try to fight that battle again. And so when I went to Princeton, the church I attended was initially independent, but it moved into the PCA, and that was the point at which I moved into the PCA as well.
Okay, so while you were at Princeton.
Yeah.
And so what was the scene like at Princeton when you were there? Was Metzger there?
Yeah, Metzger was there. I actually had him for a couple of classes. I would say that somebody asked me once how much more liberal Princeton was than Pittsburgh, and I had to disabuse them. Pittsburgh was much more liberal than Princeton was. Princeton, being sort of the flagship, as you said, the flagship Presbyterian seminary, certainly I think for the last century, or for most of the last century, has been a good percentage of the students, and my own evaluation is that a good percentage of the students at Princeton Seminary come from country club Presbyterian churches. And country club Presbyterian churches don't like radicals. They don't want people too liberal. They don't want people too conservative. And that's really what Princeton was, at least in 1980, for the 80-81 school year that I was there. I would say that the biblical studies people were all fairly critical, but in a moderate sort of way. I had more radical professors at Pittsburgh and certainly at Duke than I did at Princeton.
So both places, would you describe yourself? I mean, were you pretty much steeped in Barty and neo-orthodoxy? Is that what would describe the theology of the place?
Well, I think. Well, let me put it this way: at Pittsburgh, Bart really was considered almost a fundamentalist. At Princeton, I think Bart would have been a little conservative for most of the faculty, but not so much as he would have been at Pittsburgh.
Well, that's interesting to know. But what you the way you describe it with the country club or the tall steeple, respectable churches, that does tend to make sense. Well, so then you spent some time at Duke, which I'm sure was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I still appreciate Duke basketball, but
oh, that's terrible.
Come on now, this is a family show.
So if you play a bit,
I mean, Krzyzewski started coaching there. I think either a year or 2 years before I arrived in Durham.
So if you play a pickup game with someone now and they fall down, do you stomp them on purpose, intentionally? Is that something you learned there?
If I played a pickup basketball game with somebody, I would probably be the first one to fall down.
Okay. Well, hopefully you wouldn't get the Leitner treatment.
Yeah.
I got a funny story. I was a news photographer. Used to cover. I lived in Raleigh for a few years. Covered a few Duke Carolina games, and I was working with a photographer. And this was before Leitner was famous for stomping people. Yeah. But Leitner went out of bounds through the photographers into the cheerleaders, and coming back out, he stepped on my coworker on purpose. So that was just his thing.
Yeah.
So maybe Duke didn't ruin you altogether.
Okay.
So when you were in Durham, what sort of church did you attend there?
It was the church I attended my first year was was an evangelical PCUS church, but after that I moved to a local PCA church for a couple of years, and then was part of a PCA church plant that was set up between Durham and Chapel Hill.
Yeah, that's an interesting area, which has really boomed. I don't know how they're doing. I don't know how they're doing right now, but it seemed like right after I left, it went nuts. So maybe I was holding it back. But it's quite a place. All right, so from Duke, you went to Bob Jones. Is that right?
Yeah, not directly.
Okay.
I had started. I took a 1-year teaching contract at Wofford College in Spartanburg. I was filling in for a guy who was on sabbatical for that year. It was a 3-man religion department, and I taught everything that year that the other 2 guys didn't want to teach, and then moved over to Greenville Seminary. And it wasn't. I started at Greenville Seminary in 1991. It wasn't until Dr. Piper came in '98, however, that he encouraged me to go ahead and get a PhD. And since Bob Jones was local and convenient, that's where I went.
So you went from Pittsburgh Seminary to working with Morton Smith. That's a pretty good rank.
Yeah.
So, what would you say to people in the main line today? I mean, there are still some Orthodox believers of a sort in the main line. And we have a friend who's been on our show numerous times. He went from the PCUSA to the OPC in the last several years. So it still happens. But what would you say to a mainline person today who sees the light, as it were?
Well, I'd encourage them to find a different church. The thing about the PCUSA, there are still evangelical churches in the PCUSA, and I think I think they simply, why they have not separated. That's not a question I'm prepared to answer, but they simply continue that their connection with the denomination is loose, is what I would say. They pretty much function as independent churches. A number of those churches have joined the ECO folks, the Evangelical Covenant Order Presbyterians, within the last few years, but still, and again, I think they're by and large, probably most of them are small churches, and the Presbyterians and certainly the General Assembly don't just simply ignore them.
Well, and they're held there by property covenants, and I mean, I know someone who testified to try to help a small PCUSA church, keep their property unsuccessfully. Pretty much because it's written into the Constitution, and the civil courts are going to honor the documents and the articles that you operate by, and that's not in the favor of local churches in the PCUSA. So you were at Greenville for a long time, and now you're in Florida, and I guess you're there to stay.
As far as I know, unless. Well, I'll put it this way. That's what I'm planning on, but who knows?
I'm guessing you wear khaki shorts most days.
I'm not a shorts guy.
Oh, good. Well, me either. Good. Now Resby wears cargo shorts 363 days a year, but that's just him.
There are 52 days a year on which I wear pants, and they're all Lord's days. But the rest of the time, I'm probably wearing shorts.
Yeah.
Now, just before we get into our content, I know you have at least two other loves besides your wife, who's lovely, and as with every PCA minister, you married up about the levels, and but besides her, I know you love music and food, and you're a prog rock guy.
Yeah.
And you love the Pretenders. A mutual friend of ours tells me. No, he doesn't.
I will say this about the Pretenders: they have the perfect name.
I met the late version after the other, couple of them OD'd or whatever. I did meet the Pretenders after a concert in Memphis back about 1984. So, yeah, I'm not even sure if our mutual friend knows that, but you do. I'll say this: you're on Facebook, so if anybody becomes Facebook friends with you, they'll see that you do Facebook just right. You don't reveal too much. You're not too controversial. You're one of the few guys, one of the few PCA guys I see that will share the occasional Daryl Hart piece. Good friend of ours. You've got some range, and you do Facebook well. We generally don't recommend Facebook, but you know how to do it. So anybody wants to try to be friends with Dr. Shaw, give that a shot. But the other thing you love is food, and I know you used to prepare a lot of it. Tell our listeners about the mass food cooking you used to do.
Yeah. I guess it was in 2000. The Second Presbyterian. My wife and I were attending Second Presbyterian Church in Greenville, and that church has always done a Wednesday evening dinner before the Bible study and prayer meeting, and the person who was doing it decided they had had enough of doing it, and uh, Lynn felt like she could do that, and so volunteered. And because they didn't have any other options, they said, "Well, we'll take you on a trial basis." 18 years later, we gave the job to somebody else, never having been told that we were actually had the job. Um, but we prepared. When we first started, there were probably 80, 90 people showing up for dinner. But within just a couple of years, we were regularly serving 200 people every Wednesday night. And we had other people help us serve, but mainly, but all of the prep work was Lynn and me.
So I want to know,
I did the grunt work.
Did Mel Duncan send food back and ask you to redo it for him or anything?
Not on our watch.
Okay, he wasn't difficult. Okay, I thought he could be one of your tougher customers. Just checking on that. But for many of the, well, several of those years at least, you lived in the lovely North Carolina mountain hamlet of Silva.
Right. We former student of mine, had been called by Western Carolina Presbytery, which I think is now Highlands Presbytery, to plant a church in Silva, North Carolina, which is just down the road from Cullowhee, which is where Western Carolina University is. Western Carolina University already had an RUF chapter, but there wasn't a really close PCA church. So they asked me to plant a PCA church there. We saw that the core group for that church plant was really on the young side. And my wife and his wife had become good friends by that point. And so we decided to see if we could figure out a way to move up there and help with that church plant. And we did. We moved up there in 2011, and then were there until actually just until April of last year, April of 2019. So.
Yeah, and that man is tragically deceased. He moved down to Mississippi, I think it was, somewhere on the Gulf Coast, and cancer. But anyway, that's you all serve that church, and that's a good thing. So, can you find barbecue in Florida? That's the last personal question I have.
Yeah, there's the place called that everybody's sort of go-to place here is called Four Rivers Barbecue. It's a kind of a local chain. I think there are 4 or 5 outlets. It's good. It's good barbecue. And they go all the way from chopped pork to pulled pork to brisket to sausage to chicken to turkey. So they do the whole gamut. I don't think they do any mutton though.
Well, there's one barbecue style I want to try that I haven't. It's Western Kentucky black sauce mutton.
Yeah,
very local style. So like to
yeah.
have some of that.
I was actually out there a couple of years ago and had some of that. It was okay, but it wasn't something that I'd necessarily go hunting down.
Yeah. Well, so under the sun, the Koholeth, or the preacher, he would tell us that maybe the best thing we can do most days is enjoy our work and eat some good barbecue or something to that effect. So we'll see what you can tell us about that. You have you've read the commentary called well, there it is, Ecclesiastes Life in a Fallen World. And I want to ask you, do you consider yourself an Old Testament scholar or a Hebrew specialist, or how do you how do you
I consider myself a teacher of Hebrew and Old Testament. One thing I'm not is a scholar. This commentary isn't really a scholarly commentary. It's intended for lay folks, and I think it's written at that kind of a level, substantive, but nonetheless accessible. There are there's that great line from Harry Callahan. A man's got to know his limitations, and I figured out I figured out at least some of mine, and I try to stick within them.
So, I mean, you preached again a series 12 years ago at my church on Ecclesiastes. Have you been living in this content, this book, for a long time?
Yeah, it really goes back to a couple of my some of my coursework at Duke back in the early to mid 80s, so 82, 83. So it's been close to 40 years.
Oh, well, that's a while. It is a Banner of Truth book, and they've really sort of upgraded their presentation. Nice cover on the book, not expensive, not a thick book, not a heavy book, and prices are ranging from $8 to $12. I think I saw, and so you're not going to go broke buying this.
Some of our listeners will be interested. Are there any pictures in this book?
No.
Okay.
Word pictures, but no photographs.
Okay. That's what I was going to say. Word pictures. There you go. And there's the blurb, and of course it still had you as teaching in Greenville, which you no longer do. But
right.
So, what's the what's the 10,000-foot overview of Ecclesiastes? How do you summarize it?
I summarize it as, or one way of summarizing it, one sentence summary is, life stinks, then you die, and I'm okay with that.
All right, let's repeat that. Life stinks. This is a Presbycast ethos right here. Life stinks, then you die, and I'm okay with that. So, are you speaking for yourself? Is that the author saying that, or is that God saying He's okay with it?
No, it's the author is really saying that in a fallen world, you need to expect a fair amount of unpleasantness. Sometimes it will be severe, sometimes not so severe. But it shouldn't surprise us that there is this, and so we are. But it is not a godless world. It's simply fallen, and God provides us in all kinds of ordinary ways enjoyment. And if we ignore the small enjoyments on the search for the really big ones, we'll miss a lot of pleasure in life.
Well, that's that is helpful. I guess we should raise this unpleasant subject. Would you consider, given my co-host, would you consider professional wrestling as one of those minor pleasures along the way?
Well, I mean, not for me, but there are certainly folks for whom that's an appropriate minor pleasure.
Resby, are you with us?
I am. Yeah. No.
So basically,
it's
Dr.
rare
Shaw's,
to have. Basically, he didn't condemn me, so I'm taking this as unbridled support for my cause.
No, he basically said not that there's anything wrong with that. That's what he said. More or less. Okay. So what's the status of the book of Ecclesiastes with, let's say, the Protestant or evangelical world? Do they know what to do with it? Is it a problem? Is it just sort of a stepchild? Is it sort of the way Luther viewed the book of James as probably shouldn't even have been in there? What's the status of?
I think the status probably for most folks in the evangelical world is they don't really know what to do with it, and I think that's partly because of um, some translation choices, some of them historical and some of them more recent, with the key word in the book, which is the word translated vanity. Um, ESV translates it vanity, but that goes back to the King James, the American Standard Version, the RSV, the New American Standard Bible, all of the Bible, the New King James, all of them translated vanity. If you look at the NIV, it's meaningless. The New Living Translation, I think, is futile, um, and when the problem I have with the word vanity is that I think it's a word that nobody knows what it means anymore. And the problem with futile or meaningless is that I think that misrepresents the idea of the word. But when you read, and a lot of people these days read the NIV and they read meaningless, and so they read a book that is in the Bible and it's all about meaninglessness. And so their question is, what is this doing in the Bible? It keeps telling me that life is meaningless. And I just think that, as I say, I think that misrepresents the book. It misrepresents the word and hence misrepresents the book. The book really, the word really simply means breath. It's a puff of wind.
Vaporous.
And so
all we are is dust in the wind, dude.
Yes, it's a great Kansas song. And
Bill and Ted Bill and Ted 3 just came out on digital.
Oh, really? Okay. Good to know that. But what is breath? Well, it's brief. It's here and then it's gone. So the brevity of life is one of the themes. It's also you can't hold on to. You go out on a cold winter morning and puff of breath goes out and there's that mist there for a second, but if you try to grab it, you can't. And so it's brief, it's ephemeral, it is frustrating because you want to hold on to things and find you can't hold on to them, and that's really I think the overall theme of the book is just the brevity and frustrating character of life. And it's that way because it is fallen, because the world that we live in and we ourselves are fallen creatures.
Yeah, and we should briefly address the authorship issue. We know that there are Orthodox and conservative people who think that it's not written by Solomon and that the writer is post-exile or in the midst of exile in the later time, I guess, Persian captivity, and that he speaks as Solomon as a figure in the early part, but then shifts. But I know from reading your commentary that you believe he was the author, and you've got other reasons to believe that the word choice and the vocabulary doesn't imply what those who think that this is a post-exilic book. You don't think that that's really what they imply?
Right. I'd say first of all that even though you've got the first verse of the book up there, the words of the preacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. The phrase "son of David," obviously, when you get in the New Testament, refers to Christ, but refers to any descendant of David. But in the Old Testament, the phrase "son of David" is only ever applied to those who were the immediate sons of David: Absalom, Solomon, Adonijah. So that's one, and certainly we don't expect that either Absalom or Adonijah was the author of the book. down in verse 12, Kohelet was king in Jerusalem, which would again give us the identification of Solomon. There are a couple of words that some folks point to as being relatively late, but I would argue that one of the distinctive things about Solomon's reign was that it was an international reign. He was internationally known. People from all kinds of places visited him. They would bring their language and their terminology with them, and Solomon would be as a man of wisdom, a man of words, would certainly pick up on those things and make use of them. So, I think the arguments against Solomon's authorship all stand on fairly shaky ground.
So you're saying he was sort of a hipster,
yeah,
kind of a jet setter. So he was using the lingo of the wider world. Well, that makes sense. We should talk about the name briefly. Ecclesiastes comes from a Greek Septuagint term. So it means the convener, the preacher, the assembler. I guess a few people would say assembler of phrases and wisdom, but I think what we're talking about, the reason he's called the preacher is because he's the convener of an assembly.
Right. Yeah, I think that's probably the most useful way of identifying the term.
All right, so right out of and our reason for wanting to talk to you about this is because this sort of realistic, not overly sunny view of the world and existence, even for Christians, or we might even say lately, especially for Christians, in 2020, with political just craziness, with COVID-19, with the crashed economy, with work from home and school at home, and economic disruption, it seems particularly appropriate. So as you think about the first part of the book, I mean, one of the things that stood out to me, verse 15 of chapter 1, what is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. It seems that the modern view is that we can straighten anything because we're smart enough and we're virtuous enough and we're enlightened enough, and we can quantify everything and we can figure it out. Now, as a Hebrew scholar, you may not that may not be a good interpretation of that verse, but when I look at that, I think we need to hear that what's crooked can't be made straight. So, what is it in the first chapter or two of Ecclesiastes that you think is applicable to the mess we're in right now?
Well, I think just that there are things that when you inhabit a fallen world, there are things that are simply not fixable. Solomon, I think, in chapters 1 and 2 is really reflecting on the temptations of the fruit that faced Eve in the garden. She looked at the fruit, having listened to the serpent. She saw that it was good for food, a delight to the eyes, and desirable to make one wise. And we still have those temptations. We think that if it will satisfy our pleasure, send our pleasures, or if it will make us wise, it promises a wisdom that it can't deliver, because there are things beyond what we as finite creatures are capable of fixing. There's that was it Joni Mitchell's Woodstock song that Crosby, Stills and Nash recorded. We've got to get ourselves back to the garden. Well, Sorry, folks, it ain't happening. It ain't happening.
But what about Wendell? What about Wendell Berry? What about Wendell Berry? That's another species of the same thing, right? I mean, the agrarians, they're shooting for the same thing.
Yeah.
Well, and I think you see some of that in certain church circles, even in Presbyterianism, of because of Christ's finished work, and and I guess you could say there's a transformationalism adjacentness to the idea of going back to the garden, or the idea that because the work is finished, that we're now back in the garden, and I don't think that's true.
Yeah, it's a little bit like one of the other professors and I were talking about a particular student who seems to be in a very big hurry to get through school, and I had some of those students in seminary in Greenville, guys who seem to think that if they don't get into the pastorate immediately, the kingdom's going to come and they're going to have missed it, or that their being in the pastorate will bring in the kingdom. Well, no, it's not going to happen that way. The kingdom will come when it will come, and we are simply to be faithful in doing what we're called to do, whether the kingdom comes in our lifetime or not. I mean, yes, the kingdom is already here, but there's a not yetness to it that is a lot more glorious than anything that we are currently experiencing. And I don't care how many programs you start, how many projects you build. Those by themselves, here's another way that I think about it. We think of Western culture as, at this point, largely post-Christian, but for a long time it was Christian culture. But it took centuries to get there. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen in a 20-year period. I mean, when Augustine was writing in the early 5th century, excuse me, he was writing to a still largely pagan culture. When Aquinas was writing in the 13th century, there was still, even though Europe was nominally Christian, there was still a great deal of paganism and superstition. So it doesn't happen overnight. It happens over centuries. God works on a fairly slow timeline.
I'm wondering if a lot of those Reformed people who were trying to redeem the city, who are now fleeing the city as they fight for U-Hauls to leave New York, if they're going to go redeem the country, it'll be like you're old enough to remember the TV show Green Acres.
Oh yeah.
They're not going to enjoy they're not going to enjoy climbing up that telephone pole to make a phone call.
No.
I will say I used to live near a Green Acres barbecue stand for tri-tip sandwiches in California, and I will still, to my grave, will say it was a taste from the garden, because but that's neither here nor there now.
Barbecue, huh?
Oh yeah.
Well, in my day job, I have a mobile home park called Green Acres, insured. And it's not really a garden spot, I can tell you. But, yeah. Well, that's so I think Ecclesiastes and its viewpoint is it is really applicable to every age, but I think we especially need to hear it today.
Yeah.
Now there are some interesting translation issues, as you mentioned before, and I think some of the thornier verses, as I read your commentary, are in chapter 5, verses 8 and 9. Let me scroll to that for our online viewers, and I want to read it. And I wonder how this applies to social justice in our day. Maybe not at all, but let me read 5, 8, and 9. If you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter, for the high official is watched by a higher, and there are yet higher ones over them. But this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. Now, what in the world do those two verses mean?
Well, the 8 is, I think, fairly straightforward. We shouldn't be surprised at oppression and violations of justice and righteousness.
But I think people are surprised today. It's like in the last 3 years, tons of people have realized for the first time that there's racism and there's economic injustice and politicians are scoundrels. I like to think I knew that before, 5 years ago. But,
well, there was that gap from like 2009 to early 2017.
Yeah. Well, I've been reflecting on this, and I think the problem is that for a couple of generations, at least here in the United States, we have been telling our children that they are basically good people. We've been trying to build up self-esteem. We don't want people to think poorly of themselves, and the problem then becomes we have a population thinking themselves to be fundamentally good, and yet there's injustice, there's racism, there's all this unpleasantness. And so if there is all of this, and I'm basically good and you're basically good, where does it come from? Well, it must come from the system. The system is what is corrupt, and what we need to do is replace that system, bring in a new system that isn't corrupt. And the problem is not the system. I don't care what system you have. When you've got corrupt people running it, it will become a corrupt system. And short of the work of the Holy Spirit in redeeming and justifying and sanctifying people, it's not going to improve.
All right, so I'm glad that verse 8 is fairly straightforward, and I had a good read on that. But I think verse 9 points out some of the trouble that exists for even people who can understand Hebrew, figuring out what a few of these verses mean. So, but so I read it in the straightforward, on its face meaning in the ESV is that, there's corruption, but it's still good for everyone if the king sort of keeps the fields cultivated and keeps things orderly. I'll tell you a little quick story. You're old enough to remember Orville Faubus in Arkansas, famously segregationist governor. He ran for governor again, I think in 1982, versus Bill Clinton, and it was kind of sad. He didn't have a lot of support. He was washed up. He was 80 years old. But I'll tell you what the old people said in Arkansas. If you mentioned Orville Faubus, they would say he kept the road ditches mowed. And that's what they liked about him.
Yeah.
Now, maybe that's not really what they liked about him, but that was what they felt comfortable saying that they liked about him. But what does verse 9 mean? But this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields.
Yeah, I think the idea there is that a king or a ruler of any sort who is concerned about who recognizes that the country, any country, is built on well, certainly in the time of Solomon, any country was built on its agriculture and was dependent on its agriculture. We still are. I mean, most of us get our groceries from the supermarket, but we saw what happened early in the spring with farmers who couldn't get plants to market, who couldn't get produce to market. They were just plowing it into the ground, and that's it's a. So the ruler who recognizes the importance of that in in as a foundation for the nation. I think that's the importance of it. You know,
Yeah. Even if he's not a sweetheart.
yeah, even if he's not a sweetheart.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things we can take away from it. It also occurred to me as I went through this. There's a lot, even though some people think the book of Ecclesiastes is an outlier. Some people would say basically there's no gospel in it. There is some God in it, but there's not much gospel in it. There are sections of the New Testament that remind me, especially of Paul's writings, that remind me of it a great deal. Beginning in chapter 3, beginning in verse 16, I think it sort of summarizes, it's a good, I don't know, it sort of typifies the message of the book. Let me read that short passage and we'll talk about it briefly. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beast, for all is vanity. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and to dust all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of beast goes down, the beast goes down to the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? In my opinion, that little section is a good summary of the book. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I think so. In addition to the word that's translated vanity, there's also the phrase under the sun. And I think part of the point is that Solomon is looking at the world that we see.
Horizontally.
It's the world that's accessible to our senses. And when we look at the world that's accessible to our senses, there is no difference between man and beast. They both die. They both return to the dust. It's a reminder to us that we are not in control, that we are not though we are, in one sense, the crown of creation, to borrow a title from Jefferson Airplane. We are not omnipotent. As a matter of fact, we have as Moses says, by 70 years or by means of strength 80, and then we're gone. And the echo there, all are from dust, and to dust all return. That's right out of Genesis 3 and the pronouncement on Adam after the fall. And we don't know. We know from God telling us in His Word what happens to us after we die, but from observation we don't know. That's the point. And so, what can we do? Well, we can take enjoyment in our work. We can work hard. We can receive the blessings that God has for us. Michael Horton wrote a book called Ordinary, I think, a few years ago, that makes the point that the vast majority of the lives of most people is ordinary. And we need to learn to enjoy the ordinary and live in the ordinary, because that's all it is for most of us.
Well, that's again, I should have mentioned that under the sun is a very important phrase and concept in there. That's discussed in your book and in almost every commentary or sermon you hear on Ecclesiastes. That's made clear. But that's glad you brought that up. The section that we just read, there are a couple of New Testament Pauline sections from the epistles that made me think, that had echoes of this. So I think it's helpful to see that the Ecclesiastes is not foreign um, to what Paul understood. 1 Timothy 6-8. But godliness is actually a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. For we brought nothing into the world, so we take nothing out of it either. If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. And that sounds like something the writer of Ecclesiastes could have written.
Yeah, I think so.
And then, and I don't know, maybe Paul sounds a little more ascetic. It just says be content, maybe not enjoy it, but we know that there are exhortations in the New Testament to, enjoy the wife of your youth, enjoy food and drink. So it's Paul's not altogether more dour than Koholeth.
No.
And then in First Thessalonians, beginning in chapter 4, verse 9. Now concerning brotherly love, you have no need for anyone to write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another. For that indeed is what you are doing to all the brothers throughout Macedonia. But we urge you, brothers, to do this more and more, and to aspire to live quietly, and to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands as we instructed you, so that you may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one. That also reminds me a bit of Ecclesiastes.
Yeah.
And because, I think one of the keys to happiness is not being terribly dependent. And living quietly doesn't mean living miserably. And we always know that while we're not guaranteed riches, if we work with our hands, there's some degree of reward promised for that.
Yeah.
It may just be a common sense sort of thing that anyone can grasp, but there are echoes of this view of the world even in the New Testament.
Oh, yeah. You see it also in Romans 8, where Paul talks about the creation being subjected to futility. And you see it in James 4, where James sort of castigates those who are making all kinds of plans for themselves, reminding them that your life is a mist. You don't know that you have tomorrow. So,
yeah, and I think Ecclesiastes kind of it has this. Well, we've referenced, I don't want to say time travel, but we did reference Bill and Ted earlier already. But it does have this way of connecting the historical individuals of biblical history and the faith with the present time. Is that when you read Ecclesiastes, there's a very much a sense of this as a real person struggling with these issues, and that makes it in a lot of. I mean, I couldn't imagine the Old Testament without it,
right.
Because it shows that these struggles that we're going through now, especially in the current time, and everyone sort of has those moments, but it shows that these were people of faith struggling to make sense of what the world is and how to live that out under God, and as a result of that, I think once you come to kind of understand and embrace Ecclesiastes, I think it gives you a new love for your faith. And sort of going back to that kind of ordinary part is that it's going to be hard. There's going to be some things that seem like they almost run counterintuitive to what people in the church may say or what you think that you're supposed to believe. And yet, the Lord is still over this, and there's no sin in taking joy, even though there's great struggle elsewhere.
Yeah, it reminds me of the life of Joseph. The church we've been attending, the pastor's been preaching a series. He started a series on Joseph a couple of weeks ago. You turn to Genesis 37, and there's Joseph, and perhaps he's a bit of a smart aleck, but his brothers hate him, and they sell him off into slavery. And he gets bought by an Egyptian official, and it repeatedly in chapter 39 says the Lord was with Joseph in all that he did, and yet here he is; he's a slave in this man's house, and then the wife accuses him of attempted rape, and he's thrown into prison. And it says again, the Lord was with Joseph in all that he did. And yet here he is; he's in prison, and he's there, and then he interprets dreams for these two officials of Pharaoh, and he begs the one guy, when you get back into your position, remember me to Pharaoh. The guy forgets him, just blows him off, and so by the time Joseph is actually elevated to some status under Pharaoh after interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, he spent 13 years as a slave and in prison, and yet God was with him all the time. And that's something I think that's a lesson that we need to learn. That just because we're in a miserable situation, it doesn't mean God isn't with us, and God is using those situations to fulfill His purposes.
As Reformed people, we talk about the sovereignty of God, but sometimes we don't really believe it.
Yeah.
Or we're quite sure that everything depends more on our action than on God's. So that can be a problem. Well, you're old enough to remember when everyone was supposed to have a life verse, and if you were a preacher and you signed somebody's Bible, you were supposed to put your life verse down. There's the joke about the guy who puts down whatever the verse in the Psalms is, which says, I have a burning in my loins or something like that.
Yeah.
But I guess if I had a life verse, it's going to be Ecclesiastes 7:16 and 17. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about those for a minute, because I think they're two of the most interesting verses in the Bible. So everyone who knows me will see why I like these so much, but I like the King James translation a little better. Be not righteous over much, neither make yourself over wise. Why should you destroy yourself? And I should say I'm much better at the first half of that verse than the second. But I think that's those are probably verses, those two, that aren't preached on very much. But let's talk about what in the world, and I don't know, maybe you figured out some of this at Bob Jones University. Be not overly righteous. What does that mean?
I think it means that there is a self-righteousness that we can trick ourselves into believing is real righteousness. And when we've made our own set of rules that we can live up to, and the problem is that set of rules that we can live up to always falls short of the perfection of God's law. And so I think that's the idea, this idea of setting up a righteousness of our own, as if we had the wisdom to determine on our own how to live righteously, because ultimately it is destructive. We see the Pharisees in the New Testament, ultimately, and there was a concern for righteousness there, a concern for doing things the right way, a concern for being right. And yet, it was a concern that was on their own terms, and ultimately it was destructive. Paul comes to the point, Philippians 3 there, where he says, I had to consider all of that as just rubbish in order to have the true righteousness of Christ.
Yeah, and I think rubbish could have been translated in a more unpleasant way too, if I recall.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and, I think there's also a suggestion that maybe it be not righteous over much, overly righteous. It may imply a certain unwise kind of fastidiousness,
Right.
or an intractability, or a real personal judgmentalism, and I think it's
Yeah. The idea where you decide what's right for everybody.
right, and you're not afraid to tell them.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. So that's an interesting thing, but you don't hear a lot of sermons on that one. So it says, "Be not overly righteous, and do not make yourself too wise." Now, in your years in academia, you probably run into some people who maybe they weren't successful in making themselves too wise, but they thought they had been, or they were certainly trying.
Yeah, it's a real temptation to I think to highly educated folks that they think they know what it's very easy to think you know everything, and fact is, we're finite creatures. Uh, we have our limitations, and it's best that we learn what they are. And unfortunately, uh, too many people don't they don't know their limitations. Or to borrow another song line from Simon and Garfunkel's "The Boxer," a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest.
Hmm.
We're selective.
Yeah, it's sort of it's liberating sometimes when you go to a meeting with other, with pastors and ruling elders, and you realize you might be the dumbest person in the room,
Yeah.
and you might be the least holy person in the room. And I think before I came to a Presbyterian church, I don't think I'd ever been in a church where I wasn't pretty sure I knew as much as everyone else did. But when I landed in our church, I knew that that burden had been removed. I didn't. I was by no means the most well informed, and I probably wasn't even when I was a Baptist. I probably couldn't lay that claim. So, but yeah, my church, you know it well. It's kind of had a history of pastor scholars and incredible ruling elders. So it's an easy place not to be the smartest person.
Yeah.
All right, so it says it implies there, don't be too righteous, overly righteous. Don't make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Why can you destroy yourself by being overly righteous or over wise?
I think by just the burden that you place on yourself with the insistence on if you will a self-generated righteousness, a self-generated wisdom. It's an incredible burden to bear, and ultimately destructive, because again, it's a failure to recognize our finitude.
Yeah, and that the second half of that verse could have read, "Why should you tempt your wife to destroy yourself?" Because that can happen too if you fail in those first 2 points.
Yeah.
Now, I think the second, and I said earlier, I'm really good at verse 16, but I'm not so good at verse 17.
Mm-hmm.
Be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time? So there we've got a real cause and effect between, if you're wicked and you're a fool, you're hanging over the precipice, obviously. And we get verse 17 a lot more than we get verse 16. But anything to say about that one?
Well, I think the "be not overly wicked." Some people read that and they think, well, can I be a little wicked?
Well, you're going to be anyway.
Yeah. I think the idea there is not to be, well, illustrate it with something that's a little, not quite the same, but along the same line. I had a friend in seminary who was an hour late to pick up, he was supposed to pick up a guy at the airport, and he was an hour late to do it because he couldn't figure out whether God wanted him to take a shower or not. And there's a there's a kind of fear of doing the wrong thing that can paralyze people, and I think that's what Solomon's getting at there. You know, don't be afraid. Don't be so afraid of doing the wrong thing that you're paralyzed by it. You know, go ahead and act. Love God and do what you will, in the sense that, yeah, you're going to screw up. You're going to do some wicked things. Don't make a habit out of it, but don't be paralyzed by the fear that you might do the wrong thing.
Well, that's helpful. We do have an online question. Let me read it to you really quickly from one of our viewers. Should we consider Solomon something of a critic of his father, having borne witness to both David's prophetic gifts and human foibles as the king, a man after God's own heart, but also a lawbreaker? Do you think Solomon was exegeting David's life to any degree, or did he have enough problems of his own?
I think Solomon was, at some level, certainly he had seen his father. He had seen his father's good and he had seen his father's evil. And certainly that plays into the equation. But as we read of Solomon in 1 Kings, he was a perceptive man. He was a man who watched everything. And so I don't think that we could say, well, he's specifically, if you will, exegeting David's life. He's laying out what he observed all around him, not just in his father, but in his brothers, in other people in the kingdom, in his own officials. I think David is in there, but he's just part of the mix.
Do you think, of course, I don't know if Reformed people hold Ecclesiastes in higher esteem than others, but it seems like we ought to, because our system of doctrine should prepare us for this with our, with the tea and the tulip, and robust doctrines of sin and depravity, what we find in our catechisms and other things, even though some of it may be in Puritan language, which is a little maybe distant, or that we may misunderstand. Do you think Reformed people should have a good handle on the Ecclesiastes option, or the I called the show the Ecclesiastes option. It was a takeoff on the Benedict option, of course.
I think Reformed people should have a good grasp on it. They don't always, of course, but I think they should.
It may, I don't know if you're a millennialist or a post-millennialist, but I can't imagine that post-mills are big fans of Ecclesiastes. Probably moved on.
Seems to me a little downbeat for a real post-mill. So,
yeah. So, anything else you'd like to say? I pretty much run through the verses I wanted to talk about. Resby may have some questions, but we do know there's a vertical element in the book.
Yeah.
We do know that we're taught to regard God and seek after Him and consider His law, keep His law, live according to it. God is extolled as the Creator and as one who's sovereign. But is there anything else we should say before we wrap up about the book of Ecclesiastes?
Yeah, I think two things. Number one, God's at the center of the book, almost literally, in the first part of chapter 5. It we need to take God seriously, and most people don't. It reminds me of the story of a man who was converted. He had begun attending a church because he thought his young daughter needed some religious instruction, and he wasn't competent to give it. And shortly after he started attending this church, the pastor started preaching on the book of Genesis. And the guy says he was sitting in the back pew there, and the pastor began reading the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And he said, at that point, the hair on the back of my neck stood up because I knew it was true, and I was in big trouble. And it was out of that this man was converted. And so part of what Ecclesiastes says is don't play games with God. God made you. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Chapter 11 or chapter 12, and then the end of the matter: fear God and keep His commandments. This is what God has told you to do. Do it, and do it in the fear of God.
Yeah, I was trying to get there on the screen, but I hadn't gotten there yet. Well, that's again, your book is published by Banner of Truth. It's available. Anywhere you get books. Amazon might be cheaper, but if you buy it from someplace like Reformation Heritage or Banner of Truth directly, or Westminster Books, you're supporting good companies there. And I'm sure if someone makes the trek to Florida, that you'd be happy to sign the book for them.
I would certainly be happy to, or they can mail it to me and I'll send it back.
Or if not, I'm not going to promise them a meal.
Just a Tupperware container shipped back.
Gladware. There we go. Well, any closing words on just this season? That's an overused Reformed word, but the season that we find ourselves in 2020, in the age of all this stuff. Any encouragement, or where else in the Bible would you look for encouragement and help for the mess we find ourselves in?
Well, I think just about any page of the Bible is going to have encouragement. I think the book of Ecclesiastes is encouraging, but Isaiah 40, comfort you my people, says your God. Regardless of what kind of lunacy is going on around us, God is for us, and then that's the that should be our comfort. Heidelberg Catechism, question 1: what is your comfort in life and death? That I belong to Jesus Christ, and He is for me.
Well, we thank you for that. And anything you want to say about Reformation Bible College?
Well, I think it's a good, solid school. I would encourage it. The school has essentially 3 programs. It has a foundation year program, which is available actually online now. It's a great gap year kind of thing for somebody who maybe for someone who wants a good biblical theological foundation before they go off to university. They have an associate's 2-year program, and then they have a Bachelor of Arts in Christian Thought or a Bachelor of Arts in Biblical Studies. And I think it is good faculty. and good resources. And it's a school that I'd recommend for somebody, for any of those programs would be worth looking into.
All right. Well, thank you for that, and we'll certainly hope to have you on again one day, and maybe if there's ever another PCA General Assembly, maybe I'll see you there.
All righty.
Have you transferred your credentials down there to Presbytery?
Yeah, I did it just a couple of weeks ago.
Well, that's a noble thing, because too many people leave there, too many ministers. They do this out of bounds thing, and I want to salute you for doing the right thing and joining the proper geographical presbytery.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Doctor, and hope a lot of people enjoy your book and meet you in person here or there, or maybe even friend you on Facebook and learn all about progressive rock.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you.
Good to chat with you.
Yes, sir. And Resby will, as is his wont, tell everyone good night.
Good night. For those of you keeping track, we had references to CSN, Kansas, Jefferson Airplane, and Simon and Garfunkel. So if you had any of those four on your bingo cards, please message us, and we'll make sure to get you a souvenir. Thank you, Dr. Shaw, for coming on and for talking Ecclesiastes again. For Banner of Truth, that's Ecclesiastes, Life in a Fallen World. And we're Presbycast. Don't be an Erdman.
Magic on the internet worldwide.
All right.